Tip FM's Tip Today.
With Slattery's Garage, puck on. It's time to change. Test drive the award-winning range of Peugeot hybrids and fully electric vehicles at Slattery's Garage today. See slatterysgarage.ie.
Welcome back to Tip Today. Now, John G. O'Dwyer is with me, and we continue with our story of Ireland. Good morning to you, John.
Good morning, indeed.
Good to see you. Are we up to Mr. Henry VIII?
We're not quite, but we will get to
we
him.
will get
we're
to
not
him.
quite.
Okay. Right.
So what you're speaking about here is the last time when we finished, the last episode, what you were speaking about is that England had about 200 years of chaos.
Yes.
There was the Robert Bruce fighting against Scotland. There was wars there. That was followed by the 120-year war, which is called the 100 Years' War. But they were fighting with France for that land. They had just solved that, and then the War of the Roses broke out over which house would hold the kingship of England. That was either the Lancastrians or the House of York. So eventually that was sort of the Battle of Bosworth, where Henry VII defeated Richard III, and then he became, for the first time, a fairly powerful monarch. That was Henry. He became Now, in the meantime, what was happening in Ireland was English law. They were supposed to be the lords of Ireland, the kings.
Yes.
But they were really the English law only ran in an area about 20 miles out from Dublin in all directions. That was called the Pale. There was then the second thing, like the Butlers and the Fitzgeralds. They were the Anglo-Norman families. They were supposed then to impose the king's rule in Ireland. They were subservient to the king. King was tied up with a lot of other things, so they more or less, a lot of them went native. They did more or less their own thing. And then if you went further west to the O'Sullivans, the McCarthys, the O'Donnells, the O'Neills, they 100% independent. So that was the situation in Ireland. Then Henry VII came in. Now he was a kind of a consensual operator, a bit more like I suppose you would look at today, Joe Biden, who didn't rock the boat too much. But just to show how powerful the Irish lords felt they were, the Fitzgeralds actually supported Lambert Simnel, who was a pretender to the throne, against Henry. And would you be, it's not talked about much, they actually brought an army over and invaded England to try and drive Henry out.
What?
They invaded England with this guy Lambert Simnel.
I never heard about
Yeah,
this.
they went over. Now, they were defeated. You don't hear a lot about it. Now, if that happened most of the time, the king would arrive with an army and you'd lose your head pretty quickly. The king didn't feel strong enough to take him on even at that stage. So Gerald Fitzgerald, he just pardoned him and he went back. And in fact then, they continued to be the king's Lord Deputy in Ireland. The king always depended on these powerful families. So it settled down then into a relatively calm time under Henry, but things were beginning to change. Now, like everybody other, he had to look after the succession. What does a king need? He needs an heir, Arthur. He needs a spare, Henry, and he had two daughters as well. That was to look after his succession. So now, what happened was then, you want a powerful alliance. England was being threatened by France. What about an alliance with Spain? How do you do that?
Marriage.
You marry your son
Yes.
to Catherine of Aragon. Now, that's the interesting thing. By our standards, total child abuse. You marry a 15-year-old Arthur to a 15-year-old Catherine of Aragon. Absolutely. And they have no choice in that matter. What happens? Arthur dies fairly soon after that. But Henry is kind of pragmatic. Okay, I got the spare. I'm now going to marry the spare to Catherine of Aragon. And so now, for this, to marry your brother-in-law, you say you need a dispensation. So he had to look for a dispensation from the Pope. But the Pope's kind of okay. He's a Catholic ruler or whatever. Yeah, we'll give him his dispensation. And, the fig tree thing was that Arthur had died 6 months after the marriage, so the marriage was never actually consummated. And, now Arthur wasn't that sick or anything like that, so it's that's a bit of a figment. It gave him a handy way out, and so that was the situation there. So Henry then was the heir apparent. He became the new king.
It's so interesting with what was to come, though, that the church sort of they went along with him at this point.
Generally speaking, they did. Everything was highly political, and you wanted to keep the main rulers. You wanted to keep them on board. And remember too, the church was now facing the Reformation as well with Martin Luther. So you wanted as many friends as you could possibly have. And so that was the situation there. That's how Henry came in. And of course, he was completely different from his father. He was bombastic, in your face, got rid of people as soon as they, he didn't need them anymore, like chess pieces, moving them around. He was narcissistic as well as that, and probably didn't achieve an enormous amount in his life either, but he's probably the most famous English monarch ever.
Yeah, is he only famous because of all the marriages and the executions and all of this kind of thing? Are you saying to me that he wasn't effective other than that,
well,
was he?
He was effective. It depends. If you ask somebody in England, they would say he was effective because he made the first move to create a Protestant state for a Protestant people. But that's the important thing to remember. Henry was never actually a Protestant. He was a Catholic.
Yes.
The only thing he changed was he said the Pope is no longer the head of the church in England. I am the head of the church. But he made no doctrinal changes. In fact, he didn't like Lutherans at all and Protestants. In fact, he put more Protestants to death than Papists. He liked Catholics. Anybody who spoke to the Pope was a Papist. He didn't like them. But he hated Lutherans as well because he thought they were anti-Catholic. So he put a lot of Lutherans and Calvinists to death as well.
So when he said he was then head of the church, are you saying he was head of the Catholic Church in England?
Yeah, head of the Catholic Church. Continued on. Only one thing changed. Of course, he was the sort of fellow who was always involved in wars, and you know yourself, if you have 6 wives, it's pretty expensive to have 6 wives. So what did he do then? He saw the monasteries. He saw a handy opportunity. Hey, I'll get rid of all the monasteries and I'll grab their land. And he said, they're corrupt, so we'll get rid of them. So he got rid of one of the strongest institutions in Britain that helped the poor. And then to keep himself in power, that's the whole thing. How do you do it? You curry favour with your friends. So what do? You divvy out the monastic land to people who have supported you. So even in Ireland, the butlers were supporting him. So the land from places like Kilcooley and that was divvied out to the butlers. So, there's method in all these guys' madness as well.
Yeah, but everybody's perception is that he became Protestant and he appointed himself head of the Protestants.
No, he wouldn't have been, and the Protestants wouldn't have welcomed him as head of the church either. The Lutherans or the Calvinists, who are the two. I mean, the Lutherans the Calvinists would be like the Presbyterians today. And in fact, he had and that continued in England. What is interesting is, England, they brought in some doctrine, but they never 100% changed their doctrine. So the Anglican Church in England, it still continued on. Catholicism is high theatre, and they have the ceremonies are high theatre, and people like that, and they didn't want to change that. So the Anglicanism has a lot of features of Catholicism, and again they would be uncomfortable with the Calvinist, the Puritan end of it, which was kind of a completely joyless existence. Well, you have all the incense and you have the singing and glorification. That's very attractive in itself to people as well. So he didn't give it up. So he would have died certainly a Catholic. There's no doubt about that, but he just said, I'm the head of the church in England. That's it.
That's incredible. How did we manage to get all of that wrong through our study of history?
Well, I don't know. I suppose he's the pantomime bad guy.
Maybe.
And you want to say, kind of, you're trying to be objective here, but like, where we're coming up, it's all kind of, all these English fellows were Protestant and they sold out the Pope and they did all those. And no, he was not, there's no doubt, he was not a likeable character. But then we tried to damn him with everything else.
Do you want to go and stir trouble now? Do you want to make a comparison for me?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there could be something like that. I mean, in other words, we'll say you have a really strong-minded character who dominates everybody who's around him. And of course, if you look at that, there could be a comparison there with Trump as well as that. And also getting rid of a lot of the institutions. For example, he would have abolished the monasteries. Trump would have abolished American aid as well as that, and would have, the existing institutions like the United Nations wouldn't have much use for them. So I think there are certain parallels. I mean, not 100%, obviously, but there are certain parallels. I mean, I don't think Melania is any danger of losing her head at the moment, anyway,
So what about where Ireland is concerned then, and his influence on Ireland, specifically Henry VIII's influence on Ireland?
Well, Henry VIII's influence on Ireland then, as he got more powerful then, he decided he wanted to influence Ireland more. And the Fitzgeralds were there, and they were kind of dominating Ireland. They were the Lord Lieutenants in Ireland, and he decided, look, I want to put in my own Lord Lieutenant. He decided to put in a guy called Skeffington. He put in that guy. The Fitzgeralds didn't like it. As well as that, during his divorce, he suspected they were conniving with Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Empire, and he was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. And that's why Henry did not get his divorce. That's the most important thing. Henry didn't get, well, it would be called an annulment, but Henry didn't get that because the Pope at that stage was a prisoner of Charles V, who was then the Holy Roman Emperor. He was also the nephew and a Catholic of Catherine of Aragon. So you can imagine him saying, "Oh, Your Holiness, I don't know if giving an annulment now to Henry would be such a good idea. In fact, and I don't think you're in any position to argue at the moment." A bit like Maduro now, trying to argue. So that would be the situation there. So Henry didn't, that was it then. When he didn't get his annulment, he then broke with the church. Now, what he was trying to say, you see, what happened initially was there was an annulment required. Firstly, I mentioned that there was an annulment required for Henry to marry Catherine of Aragon at the very start. That annulment was required. Now what Henry wanted to do, he wanted to come back and say that actually that marriage was consummated. There should never have been an annulment. That would mean then Henry never married Catherine of Aragon legally, so he was a single man, and that meant then he was in love with this young one then, Anne Boleyn, and he could marry Anne Boleyn. So it was all very complicated, but of course Charles V said, "No, Your Holiness, sorry about that now, and Henry, you can sod off." But then of course that's the huge influence, because that means then that ever since then Catholic England has been essentially a Protestant country, and with one or two small times like James has been ruled by Protestant. And in fact, you can't be a monarch in England still without being Protestant.
Did Henry set foot on Irish soil, did he?
No, he never did. No, he never came to Ireland. He was always too tied up, and he had his own wars as well as that. He had wars with Scotland as well as that, and they were fighting to hold on to France at that stage, and they were losing France as well. So it was only on the very end of his time, what he did was then he clamped down on the Fitzgeralds. So he sent, what happened was when Skeffington came to Ireland, they rebelled. He demanded then that your man Gerald Fitzgerald be taken to, he called him over to London to give out to him, to say, "What are you doing? Are you talking to Charles V?" And he held on to him over there. In the meantime, then his son, Silken Thomas, you might have heard of him, he rebelled in Ireland. The Fitzgeralds rebelled in Ireland.
So Alyssa was on to say Silken Thomas Fitzgerald discuss. So
that's it, Silken Thomas. So so he then laid siege to Dublin Castle. But Henry, even though he hadn't a lot of money and he didn't have a standing army, he raised an army under this fellow Skeffington, sent him to Ireland, and a very strong army, and he overpowered Silken Thomas, and they were all then taken to London and executed. That broke the power of the Fitzgeralds for all time, and from then on you always had an English Lord Deputy in Ireland. Now, it wasn't that it mattered much at that stage. The Fitzgeralds had a power, but the O'Neills didn't have their power broken. The Butlers didn't have their power. The Burkes didn't have it. So, Ireland still, Henry could do that. He could send an army for a short time, but he was broke. The idea of fighting a huge war in Ireland to try and take on the O'Neills, who were being supported by the Scots, who had a lot of mercenaries with them, he just wasn't up to it. So what he did was he came up with a better idea, which was surrender and regrant. So what he would do is he would call in the Irish aristocracy, and he would say to them, now look, you recognise me as king and you surrender your lands, and I'll hand them all back to you, and then we won't be fighting, we'll all be hunky-dory. And of course the lords came in and said, sure, that doesn't mean anything, he can't do anything about it anyway, so we will, of course we'll surrender. So that's why you get, for example, it's always unusual, why was, we'll say, Hugh O'Neill, why was he the Earl of Tyrone? And that's because that title was granted to him by Henry. Now, when the war broke out, eventually they renounced that title. But these fellas then went on exactly as before. Nothing changed. And then Henry eventually died off. And then what happened was he had one son, Edward, then, by Jane Seymour. Yeah. And Edward... he was a Protestant, and he tried to change to Protestantism. He tried to change over to Protestant, but he wasn't long lived. In fact, he died before he reached his majority. So it was really the regents who were trying to change over to Protestantism. And then what happened was, when he died, the eldest surviving daughter became queen, and that of course was Mary Tudor, and she was a devout Catholic,
yes,
and the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Now, she's not a particularly good exemplar, because she really did hate Protestants, and she put 300 of them to death. But she didn't, that Henry just chopped their heads off. She took them out and burned them at a stake.
Wow.
Absolutely. So she earned the title Bloody Mary. Now, had she been there a long time, it's likely England would have become Catholic. But she got some kind of cancer, and then she had no issue. She had no family. So she then kind of went out of the equation. She died after about 5 years, but she did really clamp down on the Protestants.
So did this change the line of succession then completely?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Well, it changed then to there was one other surviving daughter then. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Okay, so Anne Boleyn, that's probably what did for Anne Boleyn in the end. She, even though she was the young one, she never produced a male heir, but she produced a daughter. And that daughter was Queen Elizabeth I, who was brought up then, because her mother was Anne Boleyn, a Protestant. She was brought up in a Protestant. So you can see the whole thing is all chance. Who happens to be around, and it all depends on how reproductive people are and that kind of thing. So she came in. Now, initially, she was fairly moderate. She was a moderate, person. She kind of was a Protestant, went ahead, but she didn't really clamp down on Catholics. She tried to kind of build a kind of a more consensual model of doing things. But what happened then in the end was the Pope didn't like the idea that now she had changed. You see, it had gone kind of, Henry renounced the Pope, then Edward brought in Protestantism, Mary brought in Catholicism, and remember what she did was, she recognised, which Henry never did, she overruled her father and made the Pope the head of the church in England again. She wasn't the head of the church anymore, but Elizabeth came in with the act of supremacy and said, I'm the head of the church.
But isn't it fascinating? We talk about the history of Ireland. We cannot talk about the history of Ireland without making reference to all that was going on.
Yeah, everything. No man is an island. No country is an island. You're influenced all the time.
Isn't it incredible?
It's like being a little. Ireland is like a little boat being tossed around in a turbulent sea.
The families you made reference to then, who had their own individual areas in Ireland, were they fighting among each other?
Oh, they were, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
You didn't even have to think about that. Yeah, they were. Yeah,
and that's right. It's not like that. There was, what they all wanted to do. They had no idea of an Irish nation or anything like that. All Hugh O'Neill wanted to do was get the British off his back, and he was going to do it whatever way he could, and he was brought up largely in the British court, but now it was more to form the alliance with Spain was what he wanted, because the English were putting pressure on him. So they were, but I mean they came together in the end out of necessity, O'Neill and O'Donnell. But the O'Neills and O'Donnells were sworn enemies. The O'Sullivans and the McCarthys were sworn enemies as well. So that was the sort of thing. But remember, not only that, even the great landed families of the Normans, there was a huge battle down near Lismore, and that was a battle between the Fitzgeralds of Desmond, a great Norman family, and the Butlers. The Butlers happened to win it, and that weakened the power then of the Fitzgeralds even further. There was two branches. There was the Kildares that Henry got rid of, and then the Butlers got rid of it. So the Fitzgeralds kind of went out of the equation, but they fought among themselves. I mean, there was all this territorial ambition and fighting and wars we don't hear about.
Somebody telling me about a big battle near Thurles during those times, the Desmond Rebellion, a huge cattle raid by the forces of Desmond into Tipperary, where the herd was located in Dovey near Thurles. The O'Fogartys, the Stapletons, the Purcells lost hundreds of men.
I mean, the Desmond rebellions were absolute. I mean, Munster was absolutely devastated. They'd say, about 20% of the population starved to death, because what you did was you went in and you burned all the crops so that the other army couldn't have it. You tried to starve them out. So, it was the religious wars. And remember, at this time now, what's happening is Protestantism, we'll say, if you went back even to the time of Henry VII, we were all Christians. There was English and Irish. The English thought the Irish were barbarians, but that was the only real difference. Now what you have is the first time religion is coming in, and you see Ireland as a Catholic country, and speaking a different language as well, and England as a Protestant country. So now religion is going to be an important factor in every war, which it never was before that.
Very good. All right. So what are we going to deal with next time round?
What we're going to deal with, the next time round then is we'll deal with Elizabeth, we'll deal with the war of, we'll say the 7 Years' War, which was absolutely huge. And that meant then the end of Gaelic Ireland. But again, it's much more complex, and initially Hugh O'Neill was actually a big supporter. And in the Desmond rebellions, he came down and supported Elizabeth. So,
right.
you know, that's
looking forward to it, and most informative. John, thanks very much indeed for that. That's John G. O'Dwyer.
Oh, sorry, can I just say one thing before I go?
Yes.
That I'll also be getting away from this. I'm also down, it might be a few people listening, I'll be down in Lismore talking all about the pilgrim paths of Ireland, our ancient pilgrim paths. I spoke up in Ormond there about 2 weeks ago, and I couldn't believe it. They were running around all over the hotel looking for chairs. People seem to enjoy it. I'll be talking about my own journey and discovery on the pilgrim paths, some of the light-hearted moments I had, and then the history of pilgrimage and just how difficult it was. I mean, in the old days, a pilgrimage would come into Lough Derg, something was like trying to climb Mount Everest today.
All right, brilliant. So where is that happening?
It's on in Lismore. It's on in the Heritage Centre in Lismore on Monday night at 8 p.m.
Right.
So just come along. Admission is free. It'd be great to see you.
John, thanks very much indeed. We'll take a break. Back with more.
Tip FM's Tip Today.
With Slattery's Garage, puck on. It's time to change. Test drive the award-winning range of Peugeot hybrids and fully electric vehicles at Slattery's Garage today. See slatterysgarage.ie.